Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to our virtual presentation titled The Use of WhatsApp to Foster Interpersonal Communication in Spanish. My name is ANAGONZALEZ, and I designed and implemented this action research study with Dr. YULYASENCIon, a professor at Northern Arizona University. I would like to begin by stating that the impetus of this action research study stems from our experience as language teachers. We are constantly struggling to have enough time in class to set communicative tasks so that students use the target language in context. It is important that students engage in tasks in which they exchange ideas and opinions using the second language. These tasks would give them the opportunity to observe and monitor their language production and check if their meanings and intentions are being communicated effectively. If that is not the case, they can involve in active meaning negotiation to solve communication breakdowns they may be experiencing during the interaction. Therefore, if we don't have enough time in class for tasks that foster interpersonal communication, we are not providing students with opportunities to supervise, monitor, and negotiate meanings and interactions, elements of communication that are important in second language acquisition, as proposed by Long in his interaction hypothesis. If interpersonal communication is important, how can teachers foster the practice of this mode of communication beyond the class time? Fortunately, nowadays we can use technology to provide opportunities for communication in the L2. The use of mobile devices such as cell phones and tablets are making it possible to promote language learning outside of the classroom. Recent research has provided valuable information about the apps, affordances, and benefits of mobile-assisted language learning. Among the affordances, researchers highlight that mobile technology is convenient because it's free or cheaper than computers. And due to its mobility, students can have access to data and the internet from any location at any time. Studies in the field of MAL also report affective benefits when using this technology for language learning, such as students feeling less anxiety when producing the L2 and feeling more motivation when using mobile devices to learn a second language. Mobile learning also promotes learners' agency by making students more responsible for the multimedia contents they produce for larger audiences. More recently, the application WhatsApp has received a lot of attention from language teachers, especially in the English as a second language context. Researchers have found that this application allows students to participate in synchronous and asynchronous interactions that promote active negotiations of meaning. These interactions reduce the social distance among the participants and reduce the anxiety students may experience when producing the L2. Also, using WhatsApp in the language class is promoting more student engagement with the content and in discussions outside the class. Given the affordances and benefits of using mobile technology and WhatsApp that have already been reported, we were interested in implementing an action research study to examine the use of this app in beginner Spanish classes in order to foster students' interpersonal communication outside of the classroom. Now, I'm going to describe our action research study. First, I'm going to describe the participants. Then I will explain the oral and written WhatsApp tasks we designed and the instruments we used to collect the participation data. Finally, I will talk about the procedures we followed during the study. The participants in this study consisted of 46 students in two classes of Spanish 102 Honors, a second semester Spanish course, and Spanish 201, a third semester Spanish course. All participants had had some previous experience with Spanish. They all had a smartphone, and almost half of them had the WhatsApp application already in their mobile devices. For those that did not yet have the app, we requested they download the application before the study. We designed two WhatsApp tasks for the study, one oral and one written. For both tasks, we divided the class in groups of 4 or 5 that changed every 2 weeks. For the oral tasks, one student was in charge of creating a short oral story with a mystery element. The mystery element could refer to a person, place, object, or action. The rest of the members of the group had to listen to the story and then send oral messages with questions asking for clues to solve the mystery. At the end of each week, they sent a message with their guesses. For the written task, the teacher posted an interesting news article from our webpage with graded texts in each group. Students had to read the article and send written messages giving their opinion and arguing for or against the topic, or another student's opinion. For both tasks, students had to interact with others in their small groups. In order to collect the data, we used different instruments. We administered a questionnaire to collect demographic information about students, and we also measured their interest in using WhatsApp to practice their Spanish outside of class. To measure students' participation and engagement, we kept track of the number of messages sent per student during the 10 weeks of intervention using WhatsApp tasks. Students also self-assessed their participation using a rubric, and their teachers also contributed with information about students' participation using a rubric during the 10 weeks. At the end of the study, we administered another questionnaire to measure the students' perceptions about using the WhatsApp task to practice their interpersonal communication. This study took place during a total of 12 weeks. First, we administered the pre-questionnaire and trained students on using the application to send oral and written messages. We tested the tasks and the rubrics during this training phase. Then, we alternated the written and oral tasks during 10 weeks for a total of 5 oral tasks and 5 written tasks. During the 10 weeks, students self-assessed their participation each week using a rubric. The teacher also produced a participation score for students each week using a rubric and kept track of the messages sent in each group. The week after the implementation, students completed the post-questionnaire expressing their opinions about the tasks and how they helped them in their interpersonal communication skills. Now, I will be discussing the results of this study by splitting it into 4 sections: students' participation, students' self-assessment of their participation, teachers' assessment of their participation in the tasks, and students' perceptions and attitudes towards WhatsApp. In order to measure student participation, we took a weekly tally of how many messages students sent overall. According to the rubrics we designed, in order to reach 100% in participation, it was necessary for each student to send a minimum of 3 messages each. With 46 students completing the weekly WhatsApp task, this meant that we expected a minimum of 138 messages per week, which we considered to be a 100% in participation. In this table, you can see a breakdown of the number of messages sent for each of the 5 weeks of the written and oral WhatsApp task. For 7 out of the 10 weeks, students met or exceeded the average of 3 messages per student, the highest being in the 4th week of the oral WhatsApp activity with 201 total messages, or 145.6% participation, if you will. This shows a high rate of engagement and participation in these WhatsApp tasks. The 3 weeks that did not meet the required participation were all weeks of written tasks, but even so, these averages were still in the mid-80s to low 90s, a B average. These numbers show a preference for the oral activity in terms of participation, as each week of the oral task was well over the minimum number of messages required. As you can see here, it ranged from 123% to 145% in participation, very high rates. Overall, these numbers indicate a high engagement rate on behalf of the students in these WhatsApp tasks. As I mentioned earlier, at the end of each task, students would use a rubric to evaluate their own participation in that week's task. The rubric they used was based on 3 criteria. 1. Contribution to the group discussion. Did they add something to the discussion? 2. Interaction. Did they respond to their group members and/or ask them questions? And 3. The timeliness of their contributions. Did they complete the task before the due date? The score for each criteria had a maximum of 3 points, giving an overall total of 9 possible points. As you can see in this graph, the patterns for the oral and written self-evaluations were quite different. The lowest average score per student was in week 1 of the written activity, with an average of 4.7 out of 9 points per student. We believe that this score is so much lower than all of the other weeks due to the fact that this was the first task completed after receiving training. So, these students were still familiarizing themselves with the procedure of these tasks. The highest average was in week 3 of the oral task, with an average of 7.83 points. Overall, the scores for the oral self-assessment ranged from 6.5 to 7 points out of 9, and the scores for the written tasks ranged around 4.7 to 7.8 points. We can see that, on average, students tended to self-evaluate themselves higher during the weeks of written tasks. However, for both the oral and written tasks, students demonstrated that they viewed their own participation as substantial. The teacher would also assess students' weekly participation using a slightly different rubric. It had 3 criteria similar to the previous rubric. 1. Timeliness of interactions. 2. Participation. And 3. Completed the task before the due date. The first and second criteria were worth a maximum of 4 points each, and the third worth 2 points, giving a maximum of 10 points for the teacher's assessment. Similar to the student's self-assessment, the lowest average score given by the teacher was in the first week of the written activity, again during the familiarization process, with a score of 7.17 out of 10. The highest average score came in the first week of the oral task, with an average score of 9 out of 10. Interestingly, the teacher tended to evaluate the student's participation as higher and more significant in the weeks of the oral task, the inverse of the student's self-evaluation. The range for the teacher's evaluation in the oral task was 7.8 to 9 points out of 10, and 7.1 to 8.4 out of 10 for the written task. As with the student's self-assessment, the teacher's evaluation shows a positive and significant participation in the task on behalf of the student. The results concerning students' attitudes towards WhatsApp came partially from a pre-questionnaire in which they indicated to what extent they agreed with the following statement. I would like to use WhatsApp to improve my interpersonal communication. 92% of the participants either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, demonstrating a very positive attitude towards the use of WhatsApp even prior to participating in these activities. In the post-questionnaire, We asked students to indicate how strongly they agreed or disagreed with the following two statements. 1. I felt the written WhatsApp activities helped me improve my written communication in Spanish. And 2. I felt the oral WhatsApp activities helped me improve my oral communication in Spanish. For both of these statements, the responses were overwhelmingly positive. 95% agreed or strongly agreed that the tasks improved their written communication, and 88% agreed that the oral tasks improved their oral communication. Overall, these results show that students felt positively toward how those WhatsApp tasks helped them improve their interpersonal communication in Spanish. The comments received by students about the WhatsApp tasks were generally positive, but there were certainly comments from students who did not like these tasks. I would like to share some of them with you. I think the WhatsApp has been very helpful. It really causes students to step out of their comfort zone and use the language on their own outside of class for a grade. I feel my Spanish has greatly improved from this ongoing assignment, and I would recommend continuing it. Here we see a positive comment in which a student indicates that an aspect they enjoyed of these WhatsApp tasks was how it added to the social atmosphere in the classroom. WhatsApp, they don't have much structure and I don't really like it. While this negative comment does not give much information as to what kind of structure the student would like, from interviews and post-questionnaires comments, we could glean that some students would have liked discussion questions to go with the articles for the written tasks, for example. Now, I would like to start our conclusions section by rereading our research question. Do students think that WhatsApp is a tool that can help foster interpersonal communication in Spanish? We have concluded that our students showed a positive attitudes towards WhatsApp and its ability to help them improve their interpersonal communication in Spanish. Thus, we believe these types of tasks are a worthy inclusion in the L2 curriculum so that students may practice these skills outside of the classroom. We also feel the results of this study, from the students' and teachers' assessment of participation to the number of messages students would send per week, show that there was a high degree of engagement in these tasks and were motivating to students. We also feel it would be very interesting to measure the actual improvement of students' interpersonal communication in terms of language complexity and comprehension, as this study solely measured students' participation and perceptions of their experience with WhatsApp. In summary, our students showed positive attitudes towards WhatsApp and using it to practice their interpersonal communication by showing high rates of engagement in the tasks and indicating that they themselves feel it helped improve their interpersonal communication. I would now like to share some recommendations for future studies and implementations based on our study's limitations and student comments. Provide more structure to activities. This came from various student comments in the post-questionnaire as well as interviews. Some students felt the written tasks could have been improved by adding discussion questions, for example. Require the students send a message on day 1. This came from various student interviews. The structure of these tasks required students to depend on their classmates to send messages early in the week. Requiring them on the first day of the task would help get the ball rolling earlier. Ask students to evaluate their interpersonal communication before and after the intervention. It would be valuable to ask them to evaluate themselves before and after the intervention in order to measure its effectiveness. Measuring interpersonal communication with a pre- and post-test to more objectively measure this improvement could also be worthwhile. These pre- and post-evaluations could be based on an adaptation of the actual descriptive rubrics of interpersonal communications. Our last recommendation is to assign groups based on the level of proficiency of your students. Some students complained that they had trouble being understood by it or understanding their classmates. Assigning groups based on level could help mitigate these troubles. Here are the references that we made mention of in our discussion of interpersonal communication, MAL, and WhatsApp. Thank you again for joining us in this virtual presentation. If you have any questions regarding our study, this presentation, or would like access to the study's materials, please feel free to email me at ag2643@nau.edu or Dr. YULYASENCION Delaney at julyasencion@nau.edu.